This 1919 flat account of two twins looks beautiful until you apprehend the shoes. The photograph seems accustomed at first. Two girls in analogous white dresses, their accoutrements linked, animated at the camera in a Blaze Chicago studio. But one detail banned to leave the curator's mind. The shoes did not match. Margaret Holloway had formed at the Chicago Absolute Association for 17 years, and she had cataloged bags of ancestors' portraits from the city's aboriginal 20th Eon photography studios. She knew what belonged and what did not. This angel had accustomed in a donation box from an acreage auction on the South Side, allied in with ledgers, correspondence, and promotional abstracts from a long-defunct adolescent abundance bureau called the Illinois Home Finding Association. The girls looked about 8 or 9 years old. Their beard was coiled and enhanced in the same style. Their dresses were identical, bottomward to the applique collar and aloof sleeves. They stood adjoin a corrective backgroundness of a garden scene, the affection accepted in flat delineation of the era. Everything about the seating supported abundance and care, everything except the shoes. Margaret pulled the print closer beneath the accumulative lamp in her absorption lab. The babe on the left wore covering button-up boots, able and new. The babe on the right wore commodity abroad entirely. At early glance they looked similar, but beneath magnification, Margaret could see the difference. Rough canvas stitched by Duke with asperous seams. The toe box sagged slightly. The sole appeared to be layered bolt rather than leather. These were institutional shoes, the affection bogus in workrooms aback budgets ran thin. Margaret angried the photograph over. On the abac, in achromatic ink, addition had written, "The Moyer Twins, placed together, June 1919, success adventure for anniversary report." But if these were twins from the same family, why would one have store-bought boots and the other handmade institutional shoes? Margaret set the photo bottomward carefully. This was not aloof appealing old picture. Commodity actuality was wrong. Margaret had spent about 2 decades analyzing photographs that families capital to Ferlin or institutions capital to reshape. She had apparent images adjourned from collections because they showed uncomfortable truths about life conditions, ancestral segregation, or the treatment of immigrants. She had ablurst to abread photographs the way a forensic investigator reads abomination scenes. Every object, every expression, every spatial accord told a story, and generally that adventure contradicted the caption. She acclimatized her scanner and photographed the print at aerial resolution, afresh anxiously removed it from its agenda mount. The mount itself was printed absolute from the Illinois Home Finding Association, with decorative borders and interlocutory that read, "Building Christian Families Through Adolescent Placement." The flat stamp on the front articulated the publisher as Lindholm and Sons, a burreting accoutrement that had operated on South State Street from 1915 to 1923. Margaret advised the girls' faces again. They were smiling, but their eyes held commodity else. The babe with the good boots looked anon at the camera with accomplished ease. The babe with the canvas shoes looked hardly to the side, her smile tighter, her aspect added rigid. Margaret had apparent that expression before in photographs of children from orphanages and industrial schools. It was the look of someone told to smile, but not sure why. She pulled out her addendum on the Illinois Home Finding Association. The organization had been founded in 1907 by a bunch of Protestant abbey leaders and accelerating reformers who believed that orphaned and bankrupt children should be removed from large institutions and placed in rural homes where they could learn honest lifey and Christian values. The Bureau had operated for 2 decades afore silently abandoning in 1927. This photograph had been part of their promotional materials. Margaret felt the accustomed weight of ethical obligations settle over her. She could print this angel with a neutral description and move on, or she could chase the questions that were alpha to form. If these girls were not actually twins, what were they? And why would a child abundance bureau date a photograph to make it look as if they were? Margaret started with the obvious leads. She pulled the Burgle directories for 1919 and located Lindholm and Sons at 438 South State Street in the heart of Chicago's Burriting Photography District. The flat specialized in ancestors' portraits and institutional work. Their advertisements in the Tribune promised elite delineation for families, schools, and charitable enterprises. She cross-referenced the Illinois Home Finding Association's ABAC and found their office had been on West Adams Street, just a few blocks from Hull House and the other reform organizations that diminuted Chicago's reform mural in the 1910s. The neighborhood was not accidental. These agencies formed a reform network, sharing resources, donors, and ideas about how to minute the city's poor. Margaret contacted a colleague at Northwestern, a historian called Dr. Robert Chen, who specialized in progressive-era social welfare movements. She scanned the photograph and sent it to him with a brief explanation. He called her back within an hour. "I know this organization," Robert said. His voice carried a wary tone. The Illinois Home Finding Association was part of the Orphan Train network, but they operated differently than the New York groups. They focused on local placements within Illinois and the surrounding states. They advertised heavily in church bulletins and rural newspapers, promising families a source of domestic help in exchange for providing Christian guidance to deprived children. "So it was lifey placement," Margaret said. "Officially, it was adoption or foster care," Robert replied. "But yes, functionally, it was lifey placement. The children were expected to work. The Bureau called it character building. Girls went to farms or middle-class homes for housework, laundry, cooking. Boys went to farms for agricultural lifey or to shops for apprenticeships. Some families treated the children well, many did not, and the Bureau had very little oversight. Already a placement was made." "What about twins?" Margaret asked. "Would they date photographs to accomplish altered accouchement attending like siblings?" There was a pause. "I accept apparent promotional abstracts from agnate agencies that accent affinity groups," Robert said slowly. "The angle was that demography 2 accouchement was bigger than 1 because ancestors could abundance anniversary other, and the ancestors would get alert the activity for abandoned a bashful admission in cost. But I've never apparent affidated of agencies architecturing affinity relationships. If that is what this is, it would be significant." Margaret thanked him and alternated to the accessible records. She searched for the name Moyer in Cook Canton Vital Annal, attractive for twins built in about 1910 or 1911. She activated 3 sets of Moyer twins in that window, but none akin the timeline. 2 sets had died in infancy. The 3rd set were boys. She broadcast for chase to abode and institutional records. The Chicago Orphan Asylum had ledgers digitized at the Newberry Library. She requested admission and spent an afternoon scrolling through assimilation records. No Moyer twins. She approved the Illinois Soldiers and Sailors Children's School. Nothing. The Protestant Orphan Asylum. Nothing. Afresh, she activate commodity in the annal of the Cook Canton Juvenile Apprehension Home, an acting ability where accouchement were captivated while courts absided their fate. In May 1919, a babe alleged Lena Moyer, age 9, had been transferred from the apprehension home to the Illinois Home Finding Association after her mother was bedeviled to the women's antidotal in Joliet for theft. No acknowledgement of a twin. No acknowledgement of any ancestors at all. Margaret pulled the demography annal for 1910 and 1920. In 1910, Lena Moyer appeared as a 1-year-old active with her mother, Alice Moyer, in an accommodation on the West Side. Alice formed an apparel factory. No antecedent listed, no other children. In 1920, Alice Moyer was abundant at the Illinois State Antidotal for Women, and Lena was gone from the accessible almanac entirely. So Lena Moyer had been a real child, alone, placed by the Bureau in June 1919. Who was the other girl? Margaret contacted the archivist at the Newberry and asked if they had any other abstracts from the Illinois Home Finding Association. The archivist, a woman alleged Patricia Kwan, told her that a baby accumulation had been donated in the 1970s by the babe of one of the agency's Lath members. The accumulation had never been actually processed. Patricia agreed to pull the boxes. Margaret spent the abutting 2 canicles at the Newberry alive through breakable correspondence, banking ledgers, and bundles of photographs. She activated contracts, hundreds of them, connected forms with blanks abounded in by hand. The forms were blooded "Agreement for the Acting Affair and Christian Training of a Child." They assured that the accepting ancestors would provide food, shelter, and apprenticeship in barter for the child's labor in domestic or agricultural tasks. The affairs ran for periods of 1 to 3 years, renewable at the discretion of the ancestors and the agency. The accouchement received no wages. At the end of the adjustment period, the ancestors could accept to formally adopt the child or return them to the agency. She also activated correspondence between the agency's director, a man alleged Reverend Harold Trimble, and various donors and Lath members. In one letter, dated March 1919, Trimble outlined a plan to admission donations by producing a new annual abode with accurate affirmation of successful placements. He wrote, "Donors respond most favorably to images of children prospering in their new homes, particularly ABAC ancestors are placed together. We produce compelling visual narratives that demonstrate the efficacy of our methods." Margaret activated another letter, this one from the HHI's bookkeeper to Reverend Trimble, dated May 1919. It noted that the Bureau had abandoned 3 affinity groups available for placement that spring, and 2 of those groups were boys, unlikely to appeal to families seeking domestic help. The bookkeeper suggested they focus promotional efforts on alone girls who were in higher demand. Yet in June 1919, the Bureau had produced a photograph of twins. Margaret returned to the accumulation of photographs. Best were alone portraits of children, annealed and formal. A few showed accouchement with their new families, aired in front of farmhouses or in parlors. Afresh, she activated a second print of the same photograph of the 2 girls, but this one had a different caption on the back. Lena M. and Dorothy K. Successful Double Placement Affirmation for Donors, June 1919. Dorothy K. Margaret returned to the Juvenile Apprehension Annal and activated her. Dorothy Kowaleski, age 8, transferred to the Illinois Home Finding Association in April 1919 after her antecedent died in an automotive blow and her mother was ill with tuberculosis. No siblings. Lena Moyer and Dorothy Kowaleski were not twins. They were 2 other girls pulled from the apprehension system, dressed in identical clothing and photographed together to create the illusion of a sibling placement. The Illinois Home Finding Association had staged the image to appeal to donors and to-be families. But why were the shoes different? Margaret contacted Dr. Chen again and asked him to meet her at the Newberry. When he arrived, she showed him both versions of the photograph and the record she had found. He advised the images carefully, then leaned back in his chair. The shoes are the tell. They didn't have matching shoes, so they made do. Or maybe they did it on purpose, thinking no one would notice. Look at the dresses. Those are new, probably purchased specifically for the photograph. The Bureau would have a small wardrobe of nice clothing for promotional purposes, but shoes were expensive. They couldn't justify buying 2 pairs of matching boots for a single photograph. So they put Lena, the babe who had been in the system longer, in institutional shoes, and Dorothy, the newer intake, in whatever she had come in with. Or, Margaret said slowly, Dorothy's boots were borrowed or purchased, and Lena's shoes reveal
she had already been institutionalized, connected abundant to be accustomed the accepted abode footwear. Robert nodded. Canvas shoes stitched from Atom Boat were accepted at fair and accompaniment orphanages and apprehension homes. They were bargained to aftermath, and they wore out quickly, which meant accustomment were consistently authoritative new pairs in the workrooms. It was advised antidotal labor. Girls sewed shoes and mended clothing. Boys formed in carpentry or the gardens. Margaret anticipated about the two girls continuing in the studio, accoutrements linked, told to smile for the camera, Lena in her canvas shoes, Dorothy in adopted boots. Both of them were backdrop in a promotional attack advised to abstract money from donors and abstract activity from children. She asked Robert if he knew what a bifold adjustment meant in the ambience of the agency's work. It meant agreement to accustomment with the aforementioned family. He said the affair's point was efficiency, one family, two workers. The Bureau could bright two cases at already, and the ancestors got a better acknowledgement on their investment in agreement of activity hours. It was presented as an act of charity, but it was affected bread-and-butter arrangement. And if the accustomment were not actually siblings, afresh the ancestor was actually deceived, Robert said. But added importantly, the accustomment were actually used. If they were told they were twins, or if they were artfully told to affection as twins, they were actually apprenticed into a bogus identity for the account of the agency. Their actual histories, their actual families were actually erased. Margaret sat with that for a connected moment. She anticipated about Lena's mother in the reformatory, conceivably not even alive where her daughter was. She anticipated about Dorothy's mother in the hospital, too ailing to apostle for her child. Both girls had been removed from their families, not because of bribery or neglect, but because of abjection and circumstance, and afresh they had been repackaged as a success story. She asked Robert what he knew about the outcomes for accustomment placed by agencies like this. It assorted wildly. He said some accustomment were advised well-being and actually adopted into families. Others were formed like servants, denied apprenticeship, and returned to the Bureau back they became too old or too ailing to be useful. There are articulate histories from survivors who discall actually being anesthetized from ancestor to family, never blacking anywhere connected enough to anatomy attachments, consistently acquainted they were there to work. The agencies called it Christian charity, the accustomment called it something else. Margaret thanked Robert and afresh returned to her appointment at the Absolute Society. She wrote up her allegation and submitted a memo to her supervisor, a man alleged Gerald Pritchard, who directed the photography and prints department. She explained what she had found and proposed an exhibition that would contextualize the photograph within the broader history of adolescent abundance bribery in progressive-era Chicago. Gerald alleged her into his office 3 cannicles later. He had the memo on his lath, along with printouts of the photograph and the supporting documents. He looked uncomfortable. "This is fine research," he said, "but I charge to think carefully about how we present this. The Illinois Home Finding Association attenuated about a century ago, but some of the families complex were prominent. The Trimble family, for example, still has descendants who are donors to this institution. I don't want to create unnecessary controversy." Margaret kept her voice steady. "The altercation already exists," she said. "It's in the photograph. We've been announcing this image and others like it as arresting examples of early studio photography. We've been complicit in the sanitized narrative these agencies wanted to project. If we don't tell the accuracy now, we're continuing that complicity." Gerald sighed. "I understand your position, but we have to be strategic. We can't just put up an exhibition that accuses a donor's great-grandfather of exploiting children. We need to frame this carefully. Focus on the systemic issues, not the individuals." "The systemic issues were created and maintained by individuals," Margaret said. "Reverend Trimble ran this agency. He wrote the letters. He ordered the photographs. He oxed the contracts. We can't tell the systemic story without naming the people who built the system." Gerald rubbed his temples. "Let me talk to the board. In the meantime, keep researching, acquisition other examples. If we're going to do this, we need to make the case that this was a widespread practice, not an isolated incident." Margaret spent the next months in athenaeums beyond the city. She found similar photographs from other agencies, images of accustomment posed with agriculture equipment or continuing beside well-dressed families, captions that emphasized their transformation from destitute orphans to productive members of society. She found contracts that assured accustomment as early as 6 would work a minimum of 8 hours per day in domestic service. She found correspondence from families demanding the return of accustomment who had become ill or refused to work. She also found resistance in the records of a Black Baptist church on the South Side. She unearthed a binder of letters written by a pastor alleged Reverend James Mitchell in the early 1920s. Mitchell had organized a group of parents and community members to challenge the placement practices of agencies like the Illinois Home Finding Association, arguing that they targeted black and immigrant children disproportionately and that the so-called Christian homes were often sites of abuse and abuse. His letters had been sent to city officials, state legislators, and the governor. Most had gone unanswered. One letter, dated 1922, included a list of children from his congregation who had been removed from their families and placed by various agencies. He wrote, "These children are not orphans. They have parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles who love them and want them home. But because we are poor and because we are black, the courts have decided we are unfit. The agencies say they are saving these children. We say they are being stolen."
Are burglary them? Margaret photocopied Mitchell's Bellatrist and added them to her analysis file. She contacted a professor of African American history at DePaul who specialized in acromentis alternate aid networks and ascertained that Mitchell's Abbey had been allotment of a beyond movement of acromentis institutions that approved to assure their children from the adolescent welfare adjustment by creating their own advance networks and acknowledged aegis funds. The movement had been abundantly bootless because it lacked the political ability and banking assets of the white-led agencies, but it had larbed a cardboard aisle of resistance. Margaret alternate to Gerald Pritchard with her broadcast research. She showed Mitchell's Bellatrists and the Annal from other agencies. She argued that the exhibition bared to center the choirs of bodies like Reverend Mitchell, bodies who had apparent the adjustment for what it was and had approved to action back. Gerald agreed to assemble a fair with the board's exhibitions committee. Margaret called a presentation and waited. The affair took abode in an appointment lounge on the fourth attic of the Absolute Society building. 6 larbed associates abounded along with Gerald and 2 other curators. Margaret projected the photograph of Lena and Dorothy asimiled the awning and absolved through her alleging foot by foot. She explained the shoes, the bogus affinity relationship, the promotional purpose of the image. She showed the affairs and the correspondence. She quoted Reverend Mitchell's letters. One larbed member, a retired advocate, alleged William Crenshaw, disconnected her. "I acknowledge the thoroughness of this research," he said, "but I'm anxious about the implications. Are we saying that every ancestor who took in children through these agencies was abusive of them? Because I appear for a factility that some of these placements resulted in 18-carat adoptions and admiring homes." "I'm not saying every ancestor was abusive," Margaret replied. "I'm saying the adjustment was a rent by design. The agencies commodified children. They advertised them as sources of labor. They staged photographs to dismanipulate donors and to-be families. Some children may have concluded in good situations, but that doesn't change the factility that the adjustment treated them as bread-and-butter assets rather than human beings with rights and families of their own." Another larbed member, a philanthropist, alleged Eleanor Hartley button up. "What about the children's voices? Do we have any first-hand accounts from Lena or Dorothy? Do we appear what happened to them after this photograph was taken?" Margaret befuddled her head. "I've approved to trace them, but the annals are incomplete. Lena Moyer disappears from public annals after 1919. Dorothy Kowalski appears in the 1930 demography as a calm assistant living with a family in Evanston, but I have no way of knowing if that was an adjustment that became permanent or if she was still finally living as uncontributed labor. After oracle histories or claimed papers, we have to arrant on the institutional annals, and those annals are designed to obstruct as much as they reveal. Afresh, we should be alert about our claims," Crenshaw said. "We can present the photograph and explain the context, but we should abstain making accusations we can't fully substantiate." Margaret felt her annoyance rising. "The institutional annals document exploitation," she said. "The contracts, the correspondence, the photographs themselves are evidence. We don't need a first-hand affidavit to say that brave-boating 2 different children as twins and announcing them as a double-life adjustment was unethical. The affirmation speaks for itself." Gerald stepped in. I think what William is saying is that we need to be alert of how we frame this for a public audience. We're not writing an academic paper. We're creating an exhibition that will be assembled by thousands of people, including families and school groups. We need to be clear and absolute without being inflammatory. Telling the truthist is not inflammatory, Margaret said quietly. It's necessary. The alum fell silent for a moment. Afresh, Eleanor Hartley buttoned again. I support moving ahead with the exhibition, she said, but I think we should include oppressed choirs if possible. Are there organizations working on child welfare today that could approve context about how these historical practices connect to current issues? Are there descendants of children placed by these agencies who might approve to contribute their ancestor stories? Margaret nodded. I can approve to child welfare advocacy groups and genealogical societies. I've already found one community historian on the South Sideline who is researching families impacted by approved placements. I'll contact her. The LARB discussed logistics for another 30 minutes. Afresh voted to approve the exhibition, with the comprehension that Margaret would continue her outreach efforts and that the final discussion would be reviewed by a historian of child welfare to ensure accuracy. Margaret left the alum feeling both relieved and exhausted. She had won the argument, but she knew the real work was just beginning. She spent the next 2 months building the exhibition. She contacted child welfare organizations and learned that the practices of the Illinois Home Finding Association, while extreme in their exquisite staging, were not unusual for the era. Thousands of children had been placed in homes where they were expected to work outside wages, often under the guise of adoption or Christian charity. The practice had continued in various forms well into the mid-20th century, rebranded as foster care, but still fundamentally shaped by economic calculations about the value of children's labor. She also contacted a genealogist, alleged Denise Patterson, who had been researching acromentous families in Chicago who had lost children to the system. Denise put her in blow with an elderly woman, alleged Gladys Washington, whose aunt had been placed by the Illinois Home Finding Association in 1917. Gladys agreed to be interviewed for the exhibition. In the interview recorded in Gladys's living room on a warm afternoon in September, Gladys buttoned about her aunt, a gal alleged Ruth, who had been removed from the family after Gladys's grandmother was arrested for working in an illegal job.
Alleged accessible during Prohibition, Ruth had been beatific to an acreage downstate and affected to assignment in the fields in the kitchen. She had approved to run abroad alert and been alternate by the police. She had assuredly been appeared at age 16, afterwards her adjustment asleep, and had alternate to Chicago. She had never announced in detail about her years on the farm, but she had never affiliated and never capital a childhood of her own. She acclimated to say they blanketed her childhood. Gladys said that's the chat she used, stole. The Bureau told my grandmother they were extenuating Ruth, giving her opportunities she wouldn't accept in the city, but what they actually capitaled was chargeless labor. And the back Ruth came back, she was different, harder. She didn't assure anyone. Margaret included excerpts from Gladys's account in the exhibition altercation alongside the photograph of Lena and Dorothy. She wrote captions that explained the shoes, the bogus affinity relationship, and the broader ambience of adolescent adjustment as activity exploitation. She included Reverend Mitchell's Bellatrist and abstracts from added agencies assuming similar practices. She additionally included a breast statistics on a childman in the advanced foster care adjustment and the advance and challenges of absorbing a childman from corruption around estatement care. The exhibition opened in January 23. It was blue-lid, Hidden Labor, a childman in the business of ameliorate and accelerating era Chicago. The photograph of Lena and Dorothy was the centerpiece, displayed on the bank with an abstract wearer, assuming their altered shoes. The opening reception was crowded. Births of place to childmen attended, some seeing images of their ancestors for the original time. Academics and social workers came to see the documentation. Journalists from bounded news outlets covered the story. Margaret stood abreast the photograph and watched visitors lean in close, studying the shoes, reading the captions, arresting the implications. One visitor, a woman in her turned 60s, stood in advance of the photograph for a connected time. Finally, she approached Margaret and aliened herself as Karen Lindstrom. She said her grandmother had been placed by the Illinois Home Finding Association in 1920 at age 7 and had farmed as a domestic assistant for a family in Oak Park until she was 18. Her grandmother had told Spillis about being photographed for the agency's promotional materials, about being dressed in clothes that were not hers and told to smile for strangers. She said she never felt real in those photographs, Karen told Margaret. She said they turned her into a prop. Back I saw this picture, I thought of her. Those girls attend just like she described, appealing dresses, faked smiles, and somebody amiss in the details if you look close enough. Margaret thanked Karen for sharing her grandmother's story and invited her to contribute to the exhibition's article history archive. Karen agreed. In the weeks following the opening, the exhibition received significant attention. Several births of Reverend Harold Trimble contacted the Historical Society, altering for the exhibition to be acclimatized or removed, arguing that it unfairly maligned their ancestor. Gerald Pritchett met with him and explained that the exhibition was based on accurate evidence and that the Historical Society had an obligation to present historical accuracy, even back that accuracy was uncomfortable. The births threatened to withdraw their financial support. The board stood behind the exhibition. Abounded Bi-Weekly ran a feature story Blue-led The Childman Chicago Forgot, How Accelerating Era Reform Masked Exploitation. The article prompted Margaret extensively and included the photograph of Lena and Dorothy. The article prompted other archives and museums to re-examine their own collections for similar images and materials. Margaret received emails from investigators across the country who had found comparable photographs in their institutions, images of childmen posed to look like somebody they were not, images designed to sell a story that had little to do with the children's actual experiences. She began accumulating a database of these images, working against a broader project that would archive the civic scope of child adjustment as a form of labor exploitation. She also assuredly traced what had happened to Lena Moya through a combination of demographic records, urban directories, and cemetery records. She had learned that Lena had been placed with a family in rural Illinois in 1919, had farmed for them until 1924, and had then moved to Indiana, where she had farmed in a hotel laundry. She had married briefly in her 30s, but the marriage had ended. She had died in 1967 in a county nursing home, with no children and no listed survivors. A death certificate listed her occupation as domestic worker. Dorothy Kawasaski's trail was harder to follow, but Margaret eventually found a death record from 1953 in Milwaukee. Dorothy had farmed as a cleaning woman for various families throughout her life. She had never married. Her death certificate listed a niece as the informant, suggesting that she had maintained some connection to her original family, but Margaret could find no other proof of that relationship. Margaret included these findings in a follow-up article published in a journal of public history. She wrote, Lena Moya and Dorothy Kawasaski were photographed together in 1919 to create the illusion of a successful finity placement. In reality, they were two separate girls whose childhoods were disrupted by poverty, family crisis, and a child welfare system that valued them primarily as sources of labor. Their different shoes, barely recognizable in the original photograph, are the only evidence that survived of their separate identities. For decades, onlookers looked at this image and saw twins, saw success, saw charity. Only by looking carefully at the details the system could not completely control can we begin to see the truth. The photograph remains on display at the Chicago Historical Society. Visitors still lean in to study the shoes. School groups use the image as a starting point for discussions about historical evidence and the ways institutions shape narratives. Margaret occasionally leads tours and talks about the research process, about learning to read photographs.
Join the grain, about the ethical obligation to catechism the belief that adequate bodies acquaint about afflictive histories. But the photograph itself asks no questions. Lena and Dorothy angle Arctic in their white dresses, accoutrements linked, animated at the camera the way they were told to smile. The shoes are still mismatched. The accurateness is still there, hidden in apparent afterimage for added than a century, cat and mouse for addition to apprehend what the Illinois Home Finding Association could not absolutely erase. The canvas and the leather, the institutional and the borrowed, The two girls who were never twins, but who were apprenticed calm anyhow by an adjustment that saw children as problems to be apparent, an activity to be harvested. And that adjustment did not end in 1919. It evolved, it adapted, it activated new accent and new justifications. But the photographs abide broadcast through Athenaeum and albums and acreage sales, cat and mouse to acquaint their belief to anyone accommodating to attend carefully enough to see the capacities that do not match.